Death route. I am the one. And then, my friends, another booklet that I'd like to touch upon tonight is the booklet the book actually, it's a novel, beautiful novel by one of the Russian authors that happens to live in the very extremely difficult time of the Russian history that falls into the times of Soviet Union, Stalinism, the hardest years of Stalin and his Red Terror, or continuation of Leninism under Stalin with the terror, by Mikhail Bulghakov, who was a doctor by trade and then a nurse during the First War, especially First Great War, and experienced so many atrocities, but also very vivid, very prolific author, writer. And one of his famous books, most famous book is Master and Margarita, which is the veiled and beautifully, masterly crafted novel criticizing atheism, atheistic Soviet Union of his times. That takes some guts to do that in the face of Tavarist Stalin, believe me, because for missing picture in the assembly of students of Tavarist Stalin in the 30s and 40s up to the mid-50s before he dies, the principal of any given school would get 9 millimeters of lead into the back of his head. It takes some guts. We don't experience this now. That is because in America, United States of America, even though from the beginning of the 1900s, we have in this country Communist Party of the United States of America with the predominant splits and offshoots from Chicago to New York, and even contemporary communism and socialism raising their ideas here in the country. Because we never experienced here in America terror of those two great wars on our land, terror of totalitarian dictatorship, who's going to attack or do something to you, to us? Canadians? Mexicans? I don't know. Imagine, right? And me speaking about those topics, sometimes I come through as a little bit maybe too emotional or too partial, too biased, because I lived between two nations that when you are destined or come to live between those two nations, you always sleep with one eye open. Germans and Russians are wonderful people, but for some reason their leaders are not. And believe me, once and then they decide to go into war with anybody else or each other, and who suffers? All the people who live between their borders. And that is why I have chosen those two booklets to maybe elaborate and show us ourselves something about those two authors, and maybe about some dangers of the ideologies that were born on Marxist philosophy or system of thinking, because it is much more than philosophy when you think about Marxism. And maybe tonight we can say of what it is, compared to the booklets of Animal Farm and the novel of Master and Margarita, maybe see a little bit of the practical application of Marxism with the Soviet Union and Leninism, and how it spread to even more powerful countries like China later on, and then many satellite countries who tried to establish semi-communism or communism in their own borders, within their own borders and lands. And then I hope and pray that all the freedom-loving and God-fearing people will open their minds and eyes and see that for some reason now, in the brink of this third decade of 21st century, again some revolution is brewing based on those Marxist ideas. You cannot deny it, especially when we'll go through some of them, not from me, but from the sources, Communist Manifesto, and some of the works of Stalin, Lenin, and others who gave not only theoretical foundation for those systems, but created what? Revolutions, very violent ones, to implement those systems by force. And just to let you know, some of the numbers, I didn't put this into your outlines, but A book was published in the 90s, and those statistics are from the 90s. Now with more computer power, computing power, and then more access through different free organizations or freedom-based organization to the data. In the 90s, a book was published called Black Book of Communism. And it was thorough research, absolutely, right away attacked by the left wing of the communist parties or socialist parties or democracies in Europe. But it is a valid data. And that booklet, and that's the 90s, I think 91 or 92, the authors compile some data of how many people died because or respective of communist or socialist revolutions implemented within their borders. And those are the numbers. 65 in People's Republic of China, 20 in Soviet Union, 2 in Cambodia, 2 to 5 in North Korea due to lack of sources, 2 in Ethiopia, many African countries not listed, just generally connected, another 2, 1.5 in Afghanistan, over 2 million in Eastern Bloc of European countries, and then 1 million in Vietnam, and lesser numbers to 200,000 and more in Latin American countries. And those are millions. Over 120 million people died, my friends, due to this social experiment. So how, I hope you see, tracing back that thought, that vector, to transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant when he comes with moral, absolute, that no one should suffer because of my ideas, how this compares to him, and then categorical imperative, or how this compares to the idea of this is all for the good of the people, missing or keeping in parentheses that even with the greatest ideas like this, unfortunately millions need to die. It's unacceptable, my friends, unacceptable. And then, second handout that you see in front of you that tries to explain a little bit of, or maybe before we even go to Marxism, let's now start with the question. How many of you are familiar with that little booklet, Communist Manifesto? How many of you read it or have seen it before? Heard of it, okay, just few. How many of you are familiar with those, it's very thick, few volume level of Das Kapital, or The Capital of Marx? That's a little bit more difficult to read because it's never finished, and it's a vague, very vague reading, but Communist Manifesto, it's a pamphlet that gives you, anyone who wants to join the revolution, ideas and means to achieve it right here. It's not made up, it's not only theoretical, it's practical step by step guide how to achieve communist revolution. The famous part of it is, of course, the opening and the ending of it. If you would allow me to read a little bit of the opening, and you would right away realize that you have heard about this booklet at least once. A scepter is hunting Europe, the scepter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise this scepter. Pope and Tsar, Merenchich and Gouziar, French radicals and German police spies. And then, as the booklet unfolds, it ends with that famous statement that many of you have heard, have read, and maybe came across to, about the proletariat, working people of all nations unite. And many of you have probably heard something about the international movement. that originated in France, Great Britain, and Germany, and spread eventually to the countries like Soviet Union or Russia was one of the first ones to adopt that movement, but nonetheless, it's much deeper and bigger than it is. Okay, so we are familiar with it. How many of you came across at least once with this booklet, Animal Farm, read it or heard about this or watched movie, so you're familiar, we're gonna familiar. Master and Margarita, anyone? No? I thought it's gonna be a little bit difficult because you Americans, and I say we Americans, I'm not really an American, but you love, for some reason, those suicidal Russian authors like Dostoevsky and the Crime and Punishment. Right. Maybe because it's part of school curriculum or part of the Broadway act or part of the theater here. It's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. Brother Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, Notes from the Underground. Many books by Dostoevsky are genius, are beautiful. But it's so suicidal when you think about this. It's so sad, really. Yes, he is a master, a genius of reading human psychology, human heart from different perspectives. But you see, I thought that maybe Bulghakov would be a little less known here in America, but it's a time to remedy that because his book, his novel, is so beautiful and has so many allusions, allocations of space and time. It's a novel within a novel when you think about this. But okay, so we'll go through it. Marxism and Leninism. When you would go, or if you are willing to follow the second handout number 2, that tells us in pointers, little points of what Marxism and Leninism are, I hope you understand this is just a very quick, light speed crash course on the system because there is no time and no space possibly that we can feel to bring everything that it entails into a couple of pages of paper. But right away you will see that analysis of society by Karl Marx and his friend Engels right away states or starts that it is purely materialistic. It has nothing to do with religion, faith, they claim so. Religion, faith, metaphysics, in other words, systems of philosophizing, asking about things that are not materialistic. And when we, as people who attempt to understand philosophy a little bit better, read that it is based on historical materialism or materialistic philosophy, right away in our head, we zoom back, go back to ancient Greece and ancient Hellenistic Empire. Because that was the time where philosophical monism, materialistic philosophy was born by Diogenes, you call him, Lucretius. And in his book even, Lucretius, the Rerum Naturae, on the nature of things, he claims about 100 years before Jesus was born, crafts his materialistic system of how everything, even our feelings that another systems, not materialistic, would say maybe don't belong to the matter, to the nature of matter, of physical structure. He claims everything is material. Even spirit, if exists, would be the offshoot, the produce of matter. That's hard to accept. I hope you see it, but that's that hard way of materialism, and that's how Marx based his philosophy, his ideas, on this, nothing else. And it is strange, very strange, to read through his booklets, especially Communist Manifesto, and believing him that he based everything on materialistic philosophy, on the idea that everything is matter. There is no God, no spirit, no angels, no nothing. No, it's just ridiculous. We create it in our head, projecting it. You see, while using very religious terms in his booklet, exorcism, and I would just indulge myself to read a few more for you of the ideas how Marx writes, for instance, about the abolishment of faith or religion. I quote from page 33 of Communist Manifesto. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a social tinge. Has not Christianity claimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of this charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burning of the aristocrat. When you think about this, what he's saying, this author is very familiar with the state and affairs of the church, of Christianity. What gives him that familiarity? Who knows? We know already that he is lapsed Jew. His parents and grandparents of Marx were very prominent rabbis on the father's side, but he dropped religion completely. But then he is very familiar of how to exorcise Catholic Church to get rid of God. I mean, only this can be born in the minds of the people, you see, like we talked about, that brag about spirituality and how to fix the church, how to help us, how to make all this thing perfect. Not coming once to Mass and prayer, but searching for the meaning of life, claiming to be Catholics in Nepal or Brazil, hugging the trees. We know that, my friends, and that's what every time I read some of those things baffles me. I can't understand this, comprehend it. I have my theories or ideas about why people would do that, but that's not the place nor time to discuss those. But then yet, my friends, also, when we think about Marx, and I am a wrong person to comment on it, only because of the profession, if you will, that I have chosen in my life. But I know that I have chosen it because I felt that pressure, that feeling, that voice somehow of the Holy Spirit telling me to devote your life to me, so to speak. So maybe that's wrong comparison, but I say I'm not the best example to discuss this, but Mr. Marx, after a couple of failed marriages and after a couple of alliances, friendships that he financially benefited from, very much so, what he's trying to do, as you see in that handout, he's trying to tell working people, working class, laborers, manual laborers, how to live, fix their struggles, and have better lives, not lifting a finger once. Not laboring, not working once in his lifetime, you see, physically. And he comes up with those ideas, nicely supported by people who, of course, grant him access to resources to do the research in the back room of the British Museum. You see? So that's the first filter that comes through my mind when I read about something, and right away you spot, instead of being born in blood and sweat, in something that you have experienced, you know what you're talking about, and you are representing, this is ideology, a pure one for that matter, for me. And that is why maybe entire thought of presenting you a little bit about those systems, Marxism, Leninism, Animal Farm, and Master and Margarita tonight, was born over a year ago when we talked about Dr. Jordan Peterson and then some of his books of how he comes across so strongly defying what was happening in Canada a few years ago with the legal pressure about some social construct that he says it's attack on freedom and free speech. I won't repeat those things because I am a free man and I don't believe in those. How you can make me to repeat those things. It was about the pronouns to many different genders in addition to biological genders, you know, and he started a little revolution there and took his university online. In any ways, long story short, one of the fascinations, my fascinations with that professor, who is a psychiatrist, practicing psychiatrist, very well known one for psychoanalysis from Canada, is his fascination with Soviet Union and his strong opposition to communism and socialist ideologies. He does his homework thoroughly, in his doctoral dissertation, which is called The Maps of Meaning. And then Professor Peterson, Jordan Peterson, writes this, and I will indulge myself with quoting this instead of maybe going with Mike to you, and it's a very small text. I have to take my glasses off. But in his preface to the book, in his introduction to the book, he says something about the gentleman. We will jump right after a little introduction to Marx and Lenin. He writes about Orwell and George Orwell, fascinations with the totalitarian systems after Orwell experiences for what communism is for real, after his time during Spanish War in Spain, and then his time in Soviet Union in Moscow when he saw atrocities firsthand of what communism does to people. He says this: Orwell described the great flaw of socialism and the reason for its frequent failure to attract and maintain democratic power. And of course, they are talking about Great Britain. An entire critique of Orwell is of British society that is so, let's say, in addition to proletariat, laborers, luxurious because of their what's the English word for it? History, credit record with the colonialism, you see? And he says, Orwell said essentially that socialists did not really like the poor. They merely hate the rich. And that's my anchor. That's my aha moment of all these years that I tried to understand socialism and why it fails. You are familiar with many Catholic socialist priests, socialist bishops. You know how they'd rather pursue so-called social justice fight instead of prayer, spirituality, you name it, for absolutely, completely erroneous, wrong reasons. Now going back to Marxism, on that handout number 2, my friends, you have listed some facts, factual information about Karl Marx, but you see, when he is trying to give his own assessment of the society and why society is so fragile in as far as different stratas, different groups of that society, only with about 10% or very small percentage of affluent lords, as we call them, or as he calls them, bourgeois, he comes up with those 3 very distinct pillars: societies, fibers, groups that are present in every country, in every geographical location, and he calls them proletariat, lumpen proletariat, and bourgeois, with the bourgeois being distinguished between 3 much higher upper levels. Why this is important? Because the main premise of Marxist philosophy, as far as it comes to society and then overthrowing the capitalism with socialism, is this class struggle, is that constant fight between the Lord and the servant, between the worker and the boss, so to speak, between right and wrong, left and right, you call it, you name it. And then what Marx tries to come up with is the means, the ways, or some ideas, practical ones, of how to completely turn over the state of affairs that he traces all the back to antiquity. And that's the first part of this booklet. But now I'd like to ask someone, so I can save a little bit of my voice, maybe I can ask some of you, one of you, to read for us, as I call them, 10 elements, 10 steps to achieve the socialist communist revolution, because they use those terms simultaneously. Of course, there is sublime distinctions between communism and socialism, of course. But at the beginning, at the get-go, before revolutions implement them, they use those terms simultaneously. Could we have someone with a stronger voice to read for us something, maybe? Anyone? Donald, would you? How's your eyesight? Good these days?
Good these days.
Okay, so let's start with, of course, okay?
Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and unattainable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following would be pretty generally applicable. Abolition of property in land.
That's number one, right?
Number one.
Read
Yes.
the numbers too, please.
So number one, abolition of property in land and application of all rents land to public purposes.
Okay.
Num-
You remind yourself from the history, not necessarily of America, because it never happened in America yet. But watch my word. Remember what happened when this happened. This number one element was implemented by Soviet Union in the lands that they occupied after the Bolshevik Revolution of the year 17, for instance, in Ukraine. Maybe some of the Ukrainian descent. I know we have a whole group here, traction of the Ukrainian descent. How do we call that terrible thing that happened in the 20s in Ukraine? Holodomor, which means great starvation. Over 2 million people, some say 5, died of starvation. Cannibalism was as popular as Dunkin' Donuts here. Because Tovarish Lenin said implementation of that rule might require great sacrifice. They have women, let them bear more children. In other words, each revolution devours its own children. Nobody likes to admit that, but that's what happens. Could you go to number two?
Number two, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax.
Here we go. In the Middle Ages, that everybody of non-historical background, people who don't have formal or even brush training in history would say, Middle Ages, Dark Ages, Middle Ages. Are you Middle Ages? What are you talking about? Middle Ages, you paid the 10% of everything you know, and you're done. You could have more children. That 10% will be paid even faster. When you think about this, more you have, faster you pay it. And then yet when you get into trouble, or you are born, unfortunately, into the family of so-called slaves, people who were sold because of their debts. You see, it's a snowball effect. It's not something that Europe or even Catholic Church was proud of. It was just the state of times. Nothing we can do about this now except for learning the lesson for the better. That it was wrong. It wasn't supposed to be ever, but it has been, and what? We're supposed to what? Erase it? You can't pencil it off. You can't. It's not possible. But look what's going to happen here in this country slowly. That happened in France recently. That's why, in addition to some maybe sexual problems of sexual nature, some of the French elite, especially actors, celebrities, are moving anywhere from Russia to Monaco to avoid tax that is now, anyone would recall? What is the tax bracket for the most wealthy in France? 75 to 90% of their earnings. Are you surprised they ran away? I happened to have a friend, priest friend, Father Gregoire, who used to work in France and then would tell me stories, and I would visit with him sometimes, some of those very well-established, wealthy families in Champagne region, Epernay, that produces that, Chandon, Moet, the champagne houses. For instance, Mr. and Mrs. Roger, the ones who produced their champagne for the Churchill or Royal House, they still do. You think their children will stay in France when that tax increases? But that to show you that, my friends, as I say in the last part of the handout number one, I pray and hope that freedom-loving and God-fearing people would oppose that. That's not just. Simply not just. Could you go to number 3, Donald?
Sure. Abolition of all right of inheritance.
It just pop it a couple of times, it should work, no? Maybe the battery's giving up. Try this one. Mm-hmm. Could you read the number 3 again?
Abolition of all right of inheritance.
Not here, not in America yet.
Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly.
You see the temptation, even here in America now, where all those things are going to be going. And then that should be also adding that they didn't have that yet, but abolition, banning, like it's banned in China, it's banned in Venezuela, elsewhere, stock market. Completely, no, no, no. It's going to be foreign if that implementation takes place.
Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transportation in the hands of the state.
Here we go. I lived through that, and believe me, it was no fun. No fun.
Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan.
Okay.
Number 8, equal obligation of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture.
And then I hope how you see that might be very appealing. When I was growing up in Poland and many of the socialist countries, you couldn't not work. You could not work. You will go to prison if you would just not work. You will have to have even fictional, but on paper, but work. You had to be employed. If not, oh my goodness, because the statistics, the numbers of production, means, and then produce will have to agree. If you were a single man, you would pay tax called bykowe, like the oxen tax, of not having family and children. It's a special category of tax that you'd have to pay not having family. But continue a little bit.
Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country.
Sounds familiar? Right? Soviet Union did this with all the satellite countries around Imperial Russia, thinking that's going to be that melting pot of all the cultures and languages under one language and one tovarish and one philosophy. Didn't work.
Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of child factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc.
Okay. Those numbers, thank you, Donald. Those numbers are just the examples from the booklet very self of how those means are achieved. But this also gives us another one, and then on your handout, you see it, say, handout number 2 on the back page, something called that this revolution requires this dictatorship of the proletariat, proletarians. And by that word, proletariat, proletarians, Marx means workers. But to do so, you see, that dictatorship, proletarians, workers, would have something to the extent maybe of, and I'm just giving you an examples of what I know, and you have heard of an army, or militia, police, or like in Iran today, when Muslim revolution took over the free, wonderful country, the guardians of the revolution, right? We call them, in religious state. It's always KGB or NKVD, NKWD of some sort. It's always an army of spies spying on you constantly. Neighbors so afraid that if they see something you are doing, they report it right away. And the army of the people, soldiers usually, police and soldiers, always watching, guarding, being afraid and guarded by their own superiors. Have you ever thought, experienced, or heard about the ways, like even in the 80s or 70s, America National Geographic and the other channels, when they showed some shots, some movies, some productions from Eastern Europe, how people in this mass transportation, trams, buses, on the places, marketplaces, would always be kind of gray, with their heads down, quiet, because they don't want to be noticed that they do anything against Parish, Stalin, the system, the communism, you see? And then you might ask yourself, like for instance, country where I come from, 36 million people then, members of the country, Polish people, and only about 10 million communists with 1 million of the higher echelons. You see, not that much when you think about 35 other millions who could rebel against them, and how squished they were, how they waited until that boiling point and then solidarity movement to overthrow when the planets aligned, you know, with the Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the Pope finally, Pope John Paul II, to really stand up and do something about this. We think, maybe some of you have traveled to China. I don't have any experience with China whatsoever except what I read or watch, which is limited, of course, because of the propaganda. But have you ever thought, how this is possible in the world that almost 1.5 billion people, are controlled by, let's say, 10 or 30 or 50 million communists? How possible? How come they don't come together and just, you know? Fear, they are afraid, absolutely. But most of all, to be afraid, to be fearful, you have to know that who's watching over you. Big Brother. And that shows me you read 1984 by George Orwell. That's not Animal Farm. That's another book he writes, beautiful, about utopian totalitarian system. But it's reality in many of those countries. And when you have limited news, information, no open means of communication. Think of, North Korea is a bad example maybe because it is not really, although very dangerous, it's not really very statistically clear. We don't know nothing when you think about this about North Korea. But we know a few things about China. How many dissidents and good families are escaping to America? Maybe you don't see them here in Connecticut, but you traveled Midwest, you traveled the West, Northwest, how Asian influence, especially of the Chinese people, is so present there. Not only because the old workers from the, the railroads and all this, but it's current. It's current. And within that, you think even those who migrate, even those who try to make a living here and live, even in the, let's say, million of immigrants, not a chance that 1%, 0.5%, how much is it of a million, are spies? Are you surprised that technologies were stolen from the greatest universities of America? Are you surprised that the newest Chinese jet, J-103, looks exactly like F-35, our newest jet? Those are not coincidences. Sometimes when I discuss with some of my military friends and I ask them, so you tell me, you operate on HP computers, those systems, and the processor of that HP computer is made in China, and you try to tell me where it matters when it comes to the conflict, and you push that button, it's gonna work? You know what I mean? Like, we better wake up. We better wake up to some realities. And then when heated discussions were taking place, some of you do not remember it because you are too young, but some of you remember it, you lived through it. When Ronald Reagan was president, I admire him for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that his wit. He was really smart, even though actor, celebrity, he was really smart. Not many of them are smart, I think. But he was very smart. And he would say this, Mr. Gorbachev, to Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union first secretary of the time. If you say that capitalism, if this booklet is so correct, so right, if your country based on this booklet and Tovarishch Lenin and Stalin are so right, so correct, If capitalism is so wrong and people are so oppressed in capitalistic countries, let's do border experiment. You have heard about this, right? Let's lift all the borders for 24 hours and see from where to where people migrate. End of discussion. Gorbachev never went with Reagan in that venue, in that argument anymore, because he started to notice things. This cannot stand. This is all built on ideology. It's going to fall. It's going to fall terribly, and collateral damage is going to be tremendous. I'm sorry for the digression. Could we go for a little bit more with this? Because I'd like to show you the point. When President Reagan invited Mikhail Gorbachev to come here to America, he took him for a helicopter flight over Florida. I don't know, it was West Palm Beach, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And as they were going up and up and up, Gorbachev would look down, scratching his bald head and say, what are those bluish turquoise little eyes, little points down there? And of course, President Reagan would say, those are pools. Everybody has pool here. It's so hot, you know, after work you do your hours and you just cool off in the pool. No, that's not possible. That's not possible. Can't be. You see how private property can't be in Moscow? It was central pool for youth organization and everybody would go there to swim. He started to notice things that, you know, no matter how hard you try to trample, squish, extinguish human spirit of freedom, it's only dead bodies. No result. If we can call it the result, we can't. But going back to our booklet, my friends, and our Marxism and Leninism, the gentleman, and that's your next handout, the gentleman, before we jump into the booklet, the gentleman who implemented Marx's ideas in a very practical way was someone that we know by the name Lenin, but his full name's on the back of the page of the handout number 2, that second part of it, Leninism. And who is Lenin? Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who, like Marx himself, because he was persecuted, arrested, and then exiled because of his revolutionary ideas from Tsarist monarchic Russia, in Germany and Great Britain, he, of course, came across all those internationalistic movements, and then he said, it's a great idea. That manifesto is a great idea, but it has to be implemented not peacefully, but by the revolution. And because Russia, Imperial Russia, Tsarist Russia, Russia of Nikolai II, the last Tsar of the Russian Empire, was very much agricultural, as it still is. It has the resources beyond imagination. Wood is part of it, but all the minerals, you name it. It was all agricultural. Cities, urbanization, as we think of it, as we see it, great factories and the industrial cities are not there yet. You see, it's at least 100 years behind Germany, Great Britain, France in the industrialization efforts and results. So therefore, he knows right away that that revolution in Russia will be extremely difficult because he does not have what Brits have, Germans have, French have, urban centers, cities, great cities when the poverty is so low and people for a little meal literally would do anything. But then nonetheless, something happens in Russia that eventually now we know as the 1917 revolution that Lenin tried to bring to entire world, not stop in Russia. You see, his idea of the so-called, as we call it now, Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when the great First War was almost over, he said he would rather stop fighting in that war and then carry on that revolution, that overthrow, as they call it, of the monarchic Russia, Tsar Nikolai II and his family. And here, as you can see, and you will hopefully read some of it, my friends, on the handout, you see, in each revolution, in each ideology, use of language is extremely important. Because for them is overthrowing of the planet, overthrowing of the system, overthrowing of capitalism or overthrowing of power. But in reality, it was extermination of entire family, children, and then everyone in the Tsar house. The conspiracy theories say that maybe youngest daughter of Tsar, Alexandra, lived maybe even in America for some time, but those are not proven really. But you see, that's what they mean. By control or proletariat dictatorship, Marx called it, what they mean is, I keep gun next to your hand and you do this, otherwise I kill you. That's their means of dictatorship or control. And then Lenin knows it very well, that once that movement gains traction among the Slavic people, Slavs, it can be spilled, or in other words, entire Europe can be ignited by it. Proudly say that Polish army stops him around Warsaw in 1920. We call it miracle of the Vistula River because Polish army did a couple of tactical maneuvers to really defeat the Bolshevik army going to conquer entire Europe, you see, because they had allies, secret spy services in Great Britain, in Germany, in Spain. Later on, that would become the Spanish War of the reformed radicals with the nationalist fascists with Franco. But now we think about fascists and nationalists as something wrong. No, they were trying to prevent their own country as a country from Bolshevik revolution and its implications, you see. But we need to know those things, my friends. And Lenin, who eventually is famous for this cult of a person, you know, how he was emballed and displayed in the museum and people would go and see him only probably, maybe it was 1991 or 92 when they finally buried him and eventually stopped showing him, that cult of a person, that even after death people would come and then pay homage. In other words, even with what we know about those terrors of the times, of the 20s and the 30s of Europe, of Bolshevik revolution, of how it spills into cultural revolution of China, how it spills into Cuba, how it spills into eventually some of the Latin and South American countries, how it spills over African countries, Southeast Asia, especially French Indochina, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then eventually Korea's. My friends, the movement within itself, as we call it ideology, for better or for worse, either we agree with some of those ideas or not, did not work. Instead, it annihilated, devoured so many people. There is, and I know I don't want to offend anyone, but there is in the pile, in the handout, there is that little black and white 2 pages paper piece. On the front page, you have the cows that try to explain the differences between the communism and socialism, and maybe even fascism, and then capitalism. Of the hundreds and hundreds circulating online, I have chosen this one because it's very, let's say, doesn't use vulgarities and it's kind of straightforward. But on the back of the handout, what you see is, it's just that face that has become the face, for better or for worse, our neighbor, New Yorker, of somehow Communist Party of America and socialist movement, even within the Democratic Party. But what you see underneath are those 4 scans of how that Bolshevik communist revolution worked in those countries described. My friends, we cannot forget that. You can say whatever you want and then have those ideas like, remember, absolute idealism, square circles in our head, but when you try to implement it, what? You kill 1 million people to prove that square circle exists? How you prove that, you see? And that's what those people try to do. And therefore, far from offending somebody's feelings, right is right and wrong is wrong. White is white and black is black. Evil is evil and good is good. with all the colors surrounding it, my friends. But I hope that shows you that we sometimes have to be faithful to our principles. And either people like us or not, when we voice them with the power of conviction, with everything that we understand and feel and then experience about why we should be shut down, why we should be part of so-called canceled culture. You know, like those cliches, those sayings says, believer, person of faith does not need proof. Non-believer, never enough proof would be enough for such person. So you have those, you see, questions that will never be answered. It's not about the answer. It's not about ultimate quest for the truth for those people because they don't care what the truth is, you see? And that's the whole point. It's like those questions, yes and no questions, that will never, ever, or cannot be ever answered, right? I mean, we can maybe use Donald. Donald is Michelle O'Mara's husband. Many of you know him. Donald, yes and no question only. Did you stop lying to your wife? You see, there is no way you can answer that question because it implicates already, you know what I mean? And questions like this, we can go and play those, but those are very telling. You see? And then those people like Marx, Lenin, those people were trained in something called heuristics, old ancient Greek method of winning the argument, not looking or searching for the truth. And that's the difference between you and them. You see, because you care for the truth. You are ready to die for it. And for those people, it's only profit, nothing else, only comfortable living. You know what they did to the book that came in France in the 70s called Rouge Bourgeois? Pink, red, pink actually, bourgeois, like about people who were of some influence and money and were still communists. They shredded it. Entire 2 editions of it because it addressed the point. Marxist and communist revolution produced only enablers and people who benefited from it. Separated from the masses or the workers or the proletariat they claim they care for or fight for by either high fences with the barbed wire or machine guns. Example, Mr. Fidel, God rest his soul, from Cuba, now his brother. Examples, Mr. Maduro, God rest his soul, I think he died since. And we can go and go, Mao, and others. And then yet, my friends, I hope you see that for me saying those things, leading you through some of those points and moments, even about the booklets, about the Marxist and Leninist ideas, the only agenda I have is that you will not be susceptible the more you already are. You will not give in into ideologies. Try to read stuff for what it is. When you face ideology, it will not withstand the, let's say, Ronald Reagan border experiment. It will not, because each ideology is guarded by the guardians of the revolution. Shah, when he was killed and his family in Iran didn't have that. He was open for market, business, you name it. And also Muslim. Figure that out. Possible? Possible. Now, Mr. whoever, Khamenei, president of the Iranian revolutionary country, why he needs guardians of the revolution with all that powerful weapon to guard his message? Because if he opens internet, border, market, and say, yes, our faith is important, the way we live, and Muslim faith is absolutely important for us to thrive, to live, but we keep it in perspective. We keep it in the mosques and in our hearts and in our families. Country doesn't have to be a religious country, theocracy. You see what happens then to that regime? And that happens to every regime, every single one. And then going back to the booklet, you do have 2 more handouts, my friends. One describing a little bit of Animal Farm and the main characters of George Orwell booklet. What time is it? Can you tell me what time is it? Can we still go for another maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Help yourself to coffee, some sweets. I think still we have food. Please help yourself. But I wanted to ask maybe someone with stronger voice to read for us few things highlighted here on my copy of the booklet. Andrea, could you please, if you can read only highlighted parts going through the first couple of pages, okay? And this is chapter 1 of Animal Farm, the booklet that author George Orwell Shaw calls fable, fairy tale, but in reality it's a veiled critique of very few individuals we're talking about. Could you, Andrea?
So you just want me to read
The highlighted parts, yes.
Mr. Jones, Manor Farm.
Mr. Jones, that's how it opens actually,
Yeah.
right.
Manor Farm. Old Major.
Old Major, do you remember who Old Major was? Okay, let's continue.
Been exhibited was Willingdon Beauty. He was 12 years old and had lately grown rather stout, but he was still a majestic-looking pig.
What?
A pig.
Pig,
A majestic
yes.
pig. First came the 3 dogs, Bluebell, Jessie, and Pincher. Then 2 cart horses, Boxer and Clover. After the horses came Muriel, the white goat, and Benjamin, the donkey. All the animals were now present except Moses, the tame raven, who slept on a perch behind the back door. When Major saw that they had all made themselves comfortable. Comrades, you have heard already about the strange dream that I had last
Do you
night.
recall the word the Old Major calls all his companions? Comrades, towarzysz in Russian, or in Polish, towarzyszu, towarzysz, yeah.
Before I die, I feel it my duty to pass on to you such wisdom as I have acquired. I have had a long life. I have had much time for thought as I lay alone in my stall.
Okay, you see, if this Old Major is allegory to Mr. Marx, Orwell needs to veil it, what he needs to say, right? I have all that wisdom to share with you because I lived 12 years in my pig's stall and I know everything. I know everything about life. Let's continue.
And I think I may say that I understand the nature of life on this earth as well as any animal now living. It is about this that I wish to speak to you. No animal in England knows the meaning of no animal in England is free.
Okay, and then it goes about some of the ideas that how 4-legged friends are friends and 2-legged or only birdeds are maybe not friends, but the real enemy is what? The man, Mr. Jones and everybody who represents Jones. And then when they create that animal farm, animal society, they come up with the song. Could you read that song for us,
Sure.
Andrea?
The whole thing.
The whole thing. If you can close the microphone closer to your mouth so people online can hear it too.
Beasts of England, beasts of Ireland, beasts of every land and clime, hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time. Soon or late the day is coming, tyrant man shall be o'erthrown, and the fruitful fields of England shall be trod by beasts alone.
And then it continues for many, many more stanzas, but the music to it I like to hear, and I play it when I read this, is this one. I hope we'll be able to hear it. And it goes for a while. Are you familiar with the tune? What is it? International hymn. Wyklęty powstań ludu ziemi. Cursed all the workers, proletarians of the world, unite, stand up in the great fight against oppression. And when I read that text and hear that music, what goes before me, in front of my eyes, my friends, are very unpleasant atrocities of what that system produced in a nice voiced tune that becomes eventually a song, an anthem of now all the communists, anarchists, you name it. although sometimes mutually exclusive, not really working on the same agenda, and then yet under the same banner and the same music. And then, Andrea, if I can ask you kindly to jump to or actually, no, just to save time, are you familiar, more or less you are familiar with the plot of it, right? How the animals eventually strengthen themselves and then overthrow the farmer, or what farmer represents, Mr. Jones, and take over his farm. And eventually, through different coalitions and different things, even after the fight with the neighbor, how they are still strong, making different alliances, how they even at some point with Napoleon and then Snowball, how they accept someone that they don't trust, like Mr. Moses or Raven, who represents Eastern Orthodox Church. Like in the beginning, Lenin wanted to eradicate completely, Stalin too, but they realized finally that they will never do that. They will better allow some influence of the Eastern Orthodox Church because it can, while controlled, serve their agenda. And that's what happened, and that's why now Eastern Orthodox Church, especially in Russia, faces so many problems, difficulties, because it was compromised. Because that clergy, Eastern Orthodox clergy, can have what? Wives, families, children. It's much easier to compromise someone who has so much to risk for, instead of celibate clergy who, I know we're not talking about scandals and bad things, but in general, would rather die than compromise, you see? And then when we continue with the story, eventually things get so bad that animal farms, with all those cliches, now famous sayings like all pigs are equal, but some are more equal than the others. You know, my friends, you cannot make it up. You cannot make it up. We don't have time to read this whole thing or watch the movie. It would be too destructive. But at the end, remember the ending of the book? You have it in the handout too, under Orwell and his categories and characters. When pigs and humans play cards together, some of the animals who are watching, they can't what? They cannot even say the difference between the pigs and humans, you see? And that is why that allegory, veiled charge, in other words, apologetic of the normalcy in this booklet, charging Marxism with all atrocities, has to be in the veiled form. It was banned in Soviet Union. It was banned in Poland for many years. You see, and then 1984, it's a later book, but of course, pretty much the same premise. I say this simply because, my friends, Animal Farm, and especially in the society like the United States of America, which is a free country by many regards, you know, no matter what people say and then how they would like to see it, oppressive, non-oppressive, capitalistic, non-capitalistic, very hard on poor people and privileged people, or not hard on poor and privileged people, whichever way you would like to see it, still withstands the main premise of this. Still withstands succumbing to ideology. Very difficult and very dangerous one of the socialist, Marxist, or even if you call it communist ideas. On the surface, you know, proletarians, workers of all the world unite. But why? Why? What's the premise for that unification? And when you go deep, as we did a little bit deeper to the booklet, Communist Manifesto, this booklet that shows what this unification means. Total control of everybody else who does not think like you, who does not look like you, who is not pig like you. To what extent, to what result, you see, that proletarians of all the world unite can be acceptable? I hope you see it, my friends. And then, yes, now to some extent, it happens to America, and Americans slowly, Europeans too, slowly, Australians did that big fight with the Twitter and then Facebook corporations in Australia. I hope you followed this. People are opening their eyes slowly, that only because I don't think like you and I don't feel like you, I should have a right to express it the very way like you do. And that's the real democracy, real freedom, real equal footing, so to speak. If it's off balance, look what happens. That is why I feel this little booklet, although maybe not as trendy as it was in the 80s, in America and around the world, can help us to understand a few things about ourselves. We cannot let this happen. Voluntarily, you see, no one forces us to do so. No, you don't have army, you don't have guardians of the revolution with the guns doing it to you, so you can vote, do this, that, the way that this booklet explains. But you see, like the propaganda minister of Third Reich, Mr. Joseph Goebbels, said, when you repeat a lie 1,000 times, it becomes what? The truth. And that's why we cannot, only because I read something on Facebook or watch it on Fox News or watch it on CNN or watch it on Twitter 1,000 times does not mean it's true. Use your brain and your heart, your philosophy and your power of conviction and your religion and faith to guide you. Filter those things. Because we know, my friends, how difficult it is, or how difficult the turning point is when it's too late. When it's too late. And then another booklet I wanted, or book or novel I wanted to talk to you about is, of course, Master and Margarita. And then since you, or many of you, are not familiar with it, I maybe encourage you to read it. It's not easiest to read because you will have to get to the idea of the very specific literary method of novel within the novel. Is sort of like when you read John's Gospel. For us Catholics, John's Gospel is very important text, right? But it has, let's say, a couple of Gospels within the Gospel. One of the examples of Gospel, good news in the book of John, is the story of prodigal son. How Jesus crafts that story beautiful, like it's almost cut and paste, completely different novel within the novel. Book within the book, Gospel within the Gospel. With Master and Margarita, that was written by the 40s, very hardcore Stalinism in Soviet Union, banned, not published until much later, the author, Mikhail Bulghakov, tries to hide within, shelter within the story about Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, the very yearning that many people in Soviet Union nonetheless, or regardless of the Bolshevik Revolution, still did not lose their faith. They believe in God. They yearning for prayer and liturgy. That's how Bulghakov crafts his novel about, he bases his novel a little bit on Goethe and his Faustus, his story of Mephistopheles, and how Dr. Faust is tempted by Mephistopheles, the devil, that devil would take his soul when Mephistopheles says, the moment lasts. You're so beautiful, that moment that I'd wish to last. And then within the novel of Master and Margarita and all the characters in the Soviet Union, atheistic times of Soviet Union and the characters, the story is about Pontius Pilate, really, and as the booklet calls him, Yeshua HaNotzri. It's an attempt of Bulghakov of Aramaic language to describe Jesus of Nazareth. Yeshua Minzaret or Nanzaret, that's how you pronounce this in that, or I attempt to learn Aramaic language. It's very close, but it is, you see, as the golden thread throughout the book of Master and Margarita is that entire human experience of struggle between good and evil, God and Satan, right and wrong. That even though radical system of guardians of the revolution called KGB, back then NKWD, that Bolshevik regime tries to tell you that God does not exist, tries to be atheistic country, still people feel as they have 2,000 years ago, as Jesus was dying on that cross. And you see, to have this written in a way that Master and Margarita is written, it was right away when it was published, accepted, and then now by the 90s of the past century credited as one of the top 100 books of the century. I mean, that's 20th century, of course. But what is the reason why I bring that book, that novel, to our attention is that even when times, and they will, don't get me wrong, my friends, they will go worse. They will get worse for us in America as Catholics and in the world. Some is our own doing, you know, the clergy scandals and all the bishops who were complicit in it. And, you know, when you lose authority, not many other resources you have when you think about this to keep up your faith going except that Jesus. And then part of it is just the culture we live in, secularism. Nobody needs God anymore, any longer. And then even if you don't believe me now, maybe when our children will have to submit to the prophet of green flag of Muhammad and his religion, because they will, trust me, sooner or later, as they do now in Europe slowly. Europe is completely sold off. It's completely done as far as that cultural and religious war. And then, I know I sound probably a little bit too much of a, maybe a little unstable person when it comes to this, but if you tell me that in the 21st century, possibility of ISIS, of ISIL, caliphate, is not a possibility, it's a reality that killed hundreds and thousands of people now and destroyed the cultural monuments of like Baalbek, another pre-Islam beautiful monuments in Syria, in Lebanon, and then if not for money, for Benjamins and then tourists, they would completely blow up Egyptian pyramids and Sphinx. They don't believe in it. They never existed before Muhammad. If you don't believe me that this is not yet another attempt, in addition of liberal socialist communist manifesto last chapter, then look, my friends, universe, forces in the universe never did like vacuum. When we create vacuum, cultural and religious, always stronger power takes over and tells you what to do. And they are not polite, asking you to do that. You know that. If we create such vacuum of religious and philosophical perspective here in the West, look what's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. It's not when. I'm sorry, it's not if, it's when. I say that sometimes because when my sister and my brother-in-law, when they were younger, they were like all those emancipated, liberal, minds living in the Western country because at their younger age they moved to Brussels, Belgium, and to experience a little bit of the capitalism and not that socialist Poland and all this. And sometimes when they had the kid, my niece, that is now almost 11 years old, they moved from neighborhood to neighborhood because they saw the surge of Muslim expansion with the gangs and violence there. It's about all opiates, it's about drugs, all the time, it's all the time. They're very much involved in it, those Muslim neighborhoods. And then they realized that, do I want to live in the neighborhood that after 6 or 8 p.m. I cannot even walk my dog or my daughter around the block? I want to live there. And they say, why? They take over country that was once Catholic. Why? And sometimes when I don't want to discuss them on that topic, I ask them, tell me, how many times do you pray a day? What do you mean a day? Well, we pray when we get up maybe, and before we go to bed, we just make the sign of the cross. And you are surprised that people who prayed 5 times a day for half an hour taking over your neighborhoods? Are you surprised that God is not listening to you? He listens to the one who prays 5 times a day for half an hour, regardless if they're at work or not. They take break. Boss cannot fire them, you see? And we are afraid that if I say to my CEO and I don't know, IBM, sir, now it's my prayer time. I'm going to roll my mat here and then pray to Jesus for half an hour, and you're going to pay me for it? You see what became of us? And how we like to complain about this and that and losing traction or world going into the sink, into the hell. It's our own making, our own doing. It's that story when we started with, that eventually, going backwards or going back to ancient rituals, even if we start saying Mass in our churches in Aramaic, dressing up like Jesus, these younger generations would not come. They would rather go to, Tibet, or as I say, some, jungle and hug the tree than pray with us to Jesus. Something has changed, you see. Something completely out of control is happening, and we are collateral damage or part of it. I think what we still have time for is snatch, grab the souls, people we love, and fight for them like hell, because it's not too late yet. But like Miss America to save the world, I forget it. We won't have all the time in the world to do this. That's not our point, you see. And then the last kind of couple of pages on the handout, my friends, is I wonder if you ever heard about this experiment, Universe 25. Have you? Any of you heard about this? It happened here in America in the 60s and 70s. It was very popular, but because it scared shitless completely the professor who did this and his team and many of the others who were part of it, they abandoned it and they don't talk about this anymore. But yes, originated here, and then he started to do this in his own barn because of different controversies. But Universe 25 experiment lived only about 1,500 days, but it was experiment on rodents, on mice, when very famous psychiatrist created perfect world for the families of mice, with abundance of food. You can read about this on the handout. You just have the basics of his conclusions and what he did. And for good 3-4 years, he fed the mice. There was no physical threat to it, plenty of water, plenty of food. And the results, what happened to such universe, society, paradise? Scary. Two, as the author calls, experiences of or phases of death happened. First spiritual and then physical. Healthy male rodents stopped caring about anything. As he called them, they became handsome vagabonds, doing nothing, not even wanting to procreate. They were so bored that they eventually died. Because of that, female rodents, mice, became very aggressive and started to even throw and kill their own children, throwing the little baby mice from the nests. Entire experiment showed something, my friends, that Marxism ideology will never work. Never. Read this. We don't have time to go over it. I thought some of you might be familiar with it. But this experiment shows something that is crucial, important to human race, to us humans. Of course, we are much more complex and complicated than mice. It's never going to be indicative to 100% of it. But if it shows us something, that experiment, we should read, talk about, and see what it shows us before it's too late. Before it's too late, my friends. We sense it, you feel it, you love your children, nobody questions it. You will do everything for them. You will provide them with much more than abundance of food, water, and lack of threat. Danger, physical danger. But then you realize suddenly what happens. More than less of them became ungrateful. They call you less. They do this and that less. They tend to be, and we don't have time, it's no time to go there. But I hope you see it, my friends. Sometimes when I start my confirmation class with 8th graders and their mamas and dads, when I ask them to come for orientation, I use a little bit of the shock therapy to talk to them, because mom or dad or both sit with their little baby, little student, and I say to them, those are wonderful, beautiful geniuses, your children, so wonderful, how handsome, how beautiful those girls are, how those boys, look at them. It's like, tell me, parents, when do you think they will throw you out and put you into nursing home? Before you collect Social Security or after? No, my little baby would never do it, And then, after initial shock, fades a little, they are like addicts. They look at one point and I know what they are thinking. How many more years they have in that beautiful house. But that's the reality, my friends. That's the reality, you see. And that experiment called Universe 25, read about this. It's an interesting, extremely interesting read. What happens when we spoil, when we pamper, when we don't challenge ourselves, and we forget what the real honest men's work, women's work, day's work is. That's what happens. No ideology, no proletariat revolution will fix it. It's just yet another dream, unfortunately with collateral damage of millions and millions of people. We cannot allow this to happen. Read about this, my friends. I hope this is something that you will find interesting, and maybe you will even ignite or convince or show it to your children, your teenagers. Maybe they would like to read one or two things about this before it's too late for them. Because I think if that experiment is indicative of anything, it's of their future. And then the last page are those two colored scans that I use from time to time, and some of you might have seen this before. Those circulate on the internet in certain circles, but two prophecies of two prophets. Ancient one, prophet who lived only 300 years after Jesus died, Saint Anthony of Egypt, or Great, the one who lived in great metropolis of Alexandria and eventually cashed out and ran to the desert and started to be a monk, and then just tried and pray. That's what he says after one of his visions. If it's not self-fulfilling prophecy yet, I don't know when, but this is the matter of time. I hope you see it. And another prophetess, closer to our times, is one that was still alive not long time ago, one of the three siblings that get the apparitions of the Blessed Mother in Fatima, Sister Lucia. That's what she says about the final times. My friends, you are part of it. We are part of it. Marxist revolution was only catalysator. It was only catalyst of some of those processes to come through. Now I feel it's the final chapter of that Marxist Communist Manifesto. It's the fight to live or to die not for the first blood, to death of those forces and those people behind it, and you see it. The forces, and then by the forces I don't mean any dark forces or Satan, although as a Catholic priest I would see that influence definitely there, but those forces behind Marxists and manifesto of Karl Marx infiltrated everything, every strata of our societies, from the government through academia, especially schools, and that is why we face so many problems with our children. How come? Because you see, if social construct and even language is used against us, against me as human being, it's very effective. Because it uses phraseology, it uses words that are soft and appealing. Like, those of you who follow the conflict of pro-choice and pro-life, in other words, maybe abortion and then maybe delivering the baby, and even if you can't raise it up, give it for adoption. How the language changes from abortion or killing the baby to reproductive health care. When you hear that, you don't even think about something wrong, some moral dilemmas that some people of faith maybe, especially women, because men are sometimes so, I don't know, detached from it. They don't think those ways, those categories sometimes, I feel. But that's only one part of it. The other one is the great now debate, and it's gonna be your children better get ready for it. It's gonna be this whole social construct of many more sexes than just two biological ones. Look what happens from Hollywood to your Dunkin' Donuts, local store. And that bombardment, that social technique of diluting the vocabulary and changing it completely into acceptance of something that does not even make sense or exist, but it still nonetheless happens. You see how weak the subject of that experiment is, that mice, so to speak, is, how weak and weaker and weaker and weaker. People of those times, of Poland, Soviet Union even, they fought against, many of them, underground armies, opposition against that infiltration and against that corrupt system. Can you see your children's children fighting? I mean, not like soldiers or forces, that's a calling, but in general, how they can fight if they don't even know what we are talking about? And that's how slowly, softly, ideologies delude everything from here to here and eventually physical body. Completely, completely. And that's what Donald read. It's dismantlement of everything we know and building it anew according to our standards. Who is not part of it is going to be either exiled or killed by the guardians of the revolution, called proletariat, or in our case, we don't have it yet in America, but it's coming. It's coming. And I sense it already has started with media. Look what happens. You cannot freely express your free opinion publicly because you risk your career, you risk your reputation, and very life sometimes itself. Doesn't matter what you want to say. You see, as it's not in an agreement with the group, you are outcast. You are canceled. It has been the other way around, you see. And then that's us now at St. Thomas the Apostle Parish, St. Patrick's dinner evening, and many of you came to listen to your village priest that I hope has few things to share with you. But my friends, I am passionate about those, and then I try to do my little part to encourage you, to refresh with you some of your own ideas, memories, some of your struggle maybe to be part of it, to help you to navigate through some of those nuances and distinctions, because, my friends, this is, as Sister Lucy says, this is a battle. And it is touching now to the most intimate parts of our very being, which is family, which is life, family life, our children. And look, it does not, you see, sound like revolution, but it is. They just changed the word of revolution into I would say, Julie, maybe change or progressive. You see, what is the connotation of the word progressive today? Progressive was always positive. Building, developing. America used to be the first, like that in that movie. Jeff Daniels was perfect in that, in that little clip that you see sometimes of that movie. Are you kidding me? America the first? Used to be. It used to be. Now what we develop? I mean, I love Mike Lindell and his pillow, but if that's what we develop in America and praise ourselves for, what about computers? What about steel technologies, huge trains, planes, you name it? What about mining? What about this and that? Where did it all go? Used to be the most powerful country in the world. And now, what, $30 trillion in default to China or whomever? How we justified this? What happened to us over the last 25 years? That word revolution has changed into progressive, you see? And it lost its edge and completely sane meaning of progressive being good, being acceptable, desired. Now, I hope simply, my friends, you are not afraid. You open your eyes. You voice your opinions. You are men and women of conviction and your faith and your principles, because that's the only way to show the younger generation that black is black, white is white, that right is right and wrong is wrong, that racism always existed, not only in America, everywhere else, but it only exists as long as we promote it, as we want it to exist. Think of it. If you were a person who have been given by whomever, God, aliens, whoever controls this planet, all the power in the world for one day, what would be the first thing that you would like to change? Have you ever think about this? Oh, Donald, you are that Jesus high spiritually, but I know you would like to maybe change, I don't know, your car to a new, truck or something. And I don't know, I'm just saying, right? Julie. definitely. Anyone else? Anyone else? What would you like to change if you have all the power for 24 hours? Into the Catholic Church? Thank you. No, because that belief in Jesus, if people would accept him as truth, as the real truth, I think would resolve every other problem, ultimately. Anyone else? What would you, Andrea, what would you change if you'll have like all the power in the world for 24 hours?
I just think that if we had like a mutual respect for each other.
Mutual respect for each other.
Yeah, like what Aristotle
Respect.
said.
Yeah.
Just really to understand each other.
Understand each other. I'm saying those things for people who listen maybe still online.
And to listen to each other and hear each other. I think that if we don't have a closed mind.
Yeah. If we listen and hear those two distinct parts of the communication are extremely important, because if one is shut, nothing else would work. We just talk to ourselves, or no one listens, or people yearn, want to listen, and nobody is talking. But seriously, if I would have the whole power in the world for 24 hours, the first decision I will make, because I think every single one, president of the countries here around the world, spiritual leaders, and everyone else is trying to do that, I will eradicate narcotics, drugs. You see how crazy I sound? Nobody cares. Nobody. Imagine if all those capitals, all those nice, smart presidents, men, powers of the world came in, 24 hours operation and eradicate that business completely to the ground, burn it. How safer and better this world would be? But look, you see what happens? Unless, as you say, we really devote our lives to that Jesus, everyone from the president to grave digger benefits from crime, theft, drug, you name it. Everyone is making money. Me too. Don't get me wrong, right? Preaching the good news. What needs to happen? What we need to do to change that? Because it is possible, you see? Drug addicts are not born. And I mean, unless you are a baby and mom was completely off charts, right? They are not born like saints. They are made. Who makes them? Right? And then we can go about almost anything else and see how easy it can be fixed. When, as you say, all the people listen, all the people come together and try to respect each other and agree upon certain things and realities, why then it's not done? Why the message of Jesus failed, you see, at some point? And it was twisted and maybe misinterpreted and maybe used to build empires and wealth and whatever, business, instead of forgiving and loving and having that mercy towards one another. I don't know, but you see, my friends, the way we talk about philosophy and religion, we talked about a little bit about those very extremely dangerous systems based on transcendental and absolute idealism of Kant and Hegel, and then their modifications by Marx and Lenin and Stalin. We didn't even touch Stalin, because you see, that's fascinating. Think about Parish Stalin. Before he even became communist, he wanted to become a priest, Orthodox priest. He spent 1 year in seminary. So figure that out. That's why I say this baffles me so much how people, but I think that's what we say. Human is a mystery. We are capable of becoming saints and angel-like, but I think dark side, we are also capable of committing the worst of the things. We don't even want to think about it. And how to bring the balance to it, that's our chance to kind of shake our children and teenagers and show them that if you allow yourself to be part of that experiment, Universe 25, if you, because of you have a little bit of the spoiled, pampered life, forget about realities and how brutal life can be, you will be no more very soon. So, I don't know. Thank you so much for your attention, my friends, for your presence. Hi, Julie.
The thought of jealousy. If there wasn't jealousy, we wouldn't need the power, they wouldn't need anything else. It's jealousy. We can get rid of jealousy.
Yeah, Julie says that root cause of many of those problems is jealousy. If we can get rid of jealousy, maybe that would fix it. Definitely, but you see, it's all possible, Julie. We have to just do it. I think. But thank you so much. Stay. If you have any questions, help yourself to a little bit more of coffee or grab a meal with you. We have plenty. But thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed part of it. Thank you.
Okay, so if you guys, I don't know if this is working. Okay, so if you guys want to grab any meals with you, they're over here already packaged up with all of the fixings. If you guys want to stand and grab a little bit of coffee, take it home with you, absolutely by all means, okay? So thank you so much. And hopefully Miss Michelle, she's dealing with the live stream, but hopefully she'll be out here to say goodbye to you as well. But thank you so much. It was wonderful to see you all, okay?